going to be in English, I will go ahead in English. So, welcome to the 20th Theory Talks session. Today we have a very well-known presenter, our guest. So, I'm glad to introduce Martin van Bruinessen'in. I'm very glad someone who doesn't need introduction. We all know him very well with his studies, and now today we're going to listen from him. The title of the presentation is to just say Tribes, Cemaats, Ethnic Groups, Shifting Identities and Social Theorists. So welcome, and we are very glad to see you here really, and the whole crowd. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Let me say, it is a great pleasure to be invited to a university in Turkey. 30 years ago, I would not imagine ever being invited to speak at a university in Turkey, because I thought the subjects that I had been doing research on made sure that I would never speak in an audience like this. So I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy to be at ODTÜ Technic University, because several people asked me today, have you been here before? And I remembered, yes, I was here 40 years ago. Has it changed? Well, I haven't seen enough yet. I suppose it has changed quite a bit. In those days, it was, along with Sociology University, the most prestigious university in Turkey, and I was very proud to have a friend who was teaching here and to socialize with her. And of course, I had much contact with the students who were my own generation in those days, and who had, I think, a rather different worldview from the average student today. I'm very happy to see here in the first row someone with whom I shared another meeting in Amsterdam, and whose book and edited volume is often obligatory reading for my students.
Oh, thank you.
Aisha Saktander. Very nice of you to come. Thank you. And of course, I thank the people who invite me, and I thank everyone who's come, because they expect me to talk about, I suppose, about the Kurds. But that's why I gave it the title Different Subjects. I said tribes, Cemaats, and ethnic groups, and all three have in the past, from time to time, been used as a euphemism for Kurds. But I'm trying to discuss a little bit, to investigate what type of social formations these things are, tribes and Cemaats and ethnic groups. And I'm especially interested in how they change over time, and how something that was not an ethnic group may become an ethnic group, or something that was not a tribe may become a tribe, or perhaps a tribe that may become something else, like a business association. I mean, these are processes with which we are nowadays somewhat familiar, and there's a third element, a last element in the title, social theorists. My own work is not very deep in social theory. I'm really a field worker. I like to go to places and talk to people, but from time to time I use more theoretical work because I feel it makes me look more sharply at certain aspects, and sometimes it helps me to bring out aspects of the things that I have been observing. So I will also talk about a few of the usual suspects, like Frederick Barth, or Bourdieu, perhaps, or there's lots of other famous names. Well, they come in they come along as I go on. Tribes were my first interest. When I did my first research in the 1970s, I was interested in how tribes, which seemed to be always in conflict with one another, how it was possible to achieve a sort of unity of tribes, or whether it made sense to speak of the Kurds as a people, because they seem to be divided in so many tribes. And there seemed to be not much indication that tribes were inclining to incorporating themselves into something bigger. Looking at a few historical events in which tribes could unite, I realized that in the past Sufi orders have played a role of, perhaps it's not the order itself, but it's the sheikh of the Sufi order, a man of extraordinary religious prestige, could play a role in uniting tribes for certain purposes, perhaps not for all purposes. He could end conflicts between tribes, and he could organize or make possible collective action by different tribes. So in the 19th century especially, and the early 20th century, I think both tribes, but also the Sufi orders, especially the Naqshbandiya in Turkey, have been extremely important to understand, if you want to understand how Kurds come together and start thinking of themselves as something like a people, different from other peoples. And I'm wondering whether what we see nowadays, the prominence of Cemaats, if you read about Diyarbakir, I mean, Diyarbakir seems to be divided between Hezbollah, one Cemaat, various Nur groups, other Cemaat, a Tariqa, a Sufi order that has become a Cemaat, Menzil especially, which appeals specifically to the more middle to lower groups. And sometimes I get the impression that even PKK there starts acting like another Cemaat when it's interacting with these groups. I mean, the very division of society into Cemaats enforces a way of acting that sometimes makes PKK respond well. I'll come back to that later. So I have now had tribes and Cemaats and the other ethnic group. I mean, I started thinking about what makes the Kurds a people, and then in the 80s, after I had done my first work, conflicts were occurring among Kurds in the diaspora, but also here, in debates about what makes someone a Kurd. And especially, do you have to be Kurdish speaking in order to be a Kurd? And if you don't speak, say if you only know Turkish, can you be a Kurd if you only speak Turkish? And what if you speak Zaza as your mother tongue? Are the Zaza just a subgroup of the Kurds? I have written that in my dissertation. And I said, but they are a bit different. And I started getting phone calls from Zaza people who wanted to get confirmation from me that the Zazas are really very different. And he said, our language, it's not a dialect, it is a language, right? I said, well, I'm not a linguist, but many linguists think it is different, but why would that matter? Anyway, there were these debates about, do Zazas have to be Kurds? Well, Kurdish nationalists, of course, said, yes, you have to be a Kurd. And mirroring Turkish language policies, I remember that in Paris, when the Kurdish Institute started publishing a journal in Kurdish, with a section in Sorani, southern Kurdish, the Kurdish of the people of Iraq and Iran, Kurmanji, and a third section in Zazaki, that there were some Kurdish nationalists who said, this is not good. You are contributing to dividing the Kurds. It is bad enough that we have two standard dialects, Sorani and Kurmanji. Why would we divide further? So there was at least a sense that the existence and the continued existence and perhaps the development of a separate culture of Zaza was a threat to the existence or cohesiveness of the Kurdish nation. So I'm going to speak a little bit about those questions. And, well, let me start with a voice from the past. As I said, I was here in the 70s, and in the late 1970s, I still remember the title of a column in Milliyet newspaper, which said, Bende etni grubum. You remember it? I am also an ethnic group. This was a response to the fact that Sharafuddin Elchi, who was a minister in the National Front government, had declared in answer to a journalist, of course there are Kurds in Turkey. I am also a Kurd. And mayhem broke out. He had to retire. And the journalist wanted to bring up the existence of Kurds by saying, well, an ethnic group is basically an alternative, a euphemism for Kurds. When people were speaking about ethnic groups, they really meant Kurds. Kurds were the unspoken, everyone knew that they existed, everyone felt that they existed, but you couldn't mention them. It was like magic. If you mention them, they become more existent. So it's better not to mention them. If you keep them vague, like ethnic groups, it is perhaps manageable. But gradually, ethnic groups became part of the public discourse. And in 1989, I remember another important event. A book was published in English, but offered by the writer, presented to General Evren, with the title Ethnic Groups in the Republic of Turkey, edited by Peter Andrews. It was briefly, sections of it were briefly published in Turkish, but immediately banned, and I think so far the book does not exist in English. It remains a fascinating book. It's a very important, very thick volume, full of information about all the ethnic groups of Turkey. If you thought that there were only Turks and Kurds in Turkey, this book told you different. There are 47, according to this book, 47 ethnic groups in Turkey. So the question is, what do they mean by ethnic groups? And the author, Peter Andrews, took a somewhat naive and very old-fashioned definition of what constitutes an ethnic group. A group with its own language and religion, and in some cases, specific type of social organization, tribal structure, defines what is an ethnic group. So, for him, the Kurds were not an ethnic group, but 5 ethnic groups, because you have Zaza-speaking Sunni Kurds, you have Zaza-speaking Alevi Kurds, Kurmanji-speaking Sunni Kurds, Kurmanji-speaking Alevi Kurds, and Kurmanji-speaking Yazidis. He did not mention Turkish-speaking Kurds, of which there are also many, but let's say 5. Turks, there are even many more. Among the Turkmen, he mentioned several Turkmen tribes as distinct ethnic groups. You have the Tahtacı, who are Alevi and Turkish-speaking, but different from the other Turkish-speaking Alevis and so on. And then we have all these other languages and other groups that very few people knew about. The author had himself traveled very, very extensively in Turkey, and he had studied almost all the dissertations, theses, master theses, and local histories existing in Turkey to compile very detailed information about who lives where, and he has maps that are deceptively precise, that show exactly which villages are Kurdish, which villages are Arab, Laz, and so on. I have to admit that I had a little article in that book also. He had asked me to write about ethnic identity of the Kurds, and I tried to suggest that identity is not all that self-evident. I looked at processes in which we saw that a tribe, an existing tribe whose history we can trace for several centuries, in the past was Turkish, Turkish-speaking, but later became Kurdish. The Karaketçili on the Karacadağ near Diyarbakır still have a memory of once having been Turks, but they're now Kurds, and many of them are Kurdish nationalists. On the other hand, there are also Turkish formations that have a memory of Kurds having merged into these tribes. In the Chechny tribes, the Chechny are perhaps one of the Turkish tribes, but in many Chechny tribes you find small sections of Kurds that have attached themselves to them. And they're Chechny, so Kurdish Chechny. In the Tor Abdin you have this tribe called Pahlani. They speak Arabic, and they have a vague memory of in the past having been Christians, and before that vague past having been fire worshippers or sun worshippers. And at the time when I was doing research there, they thought they were Kurds. They spoke Arabic, but they were Kurds. Just Kurds like the other tribes of the region. And those who migrated to Lebanon, there was a huge migration from Lebanon, from Mardin province to Lebanon. It was first Suryani who went, But then in their wake, also Kurds and Bahalami, Arabic speakers, moved there. And the Bahalami of Lebanon became the core of an organization of Lebanese Kurds. So Arabness, Kurdishness, Turkishness seem to be more fluid concepts. They're not so essential and unchanging as nationalists would like them to be. There was one large tribe about which I had written, the Mili Confederacy. Historians know, of course, Ibrahim Pasha Mili, the great Ahmadiyya commander and great supporter of Abdul Hamid. His tribe sometimes was big, sometimes was small, and in its heyday it had sections that were Arabic speaking, it had Kurmanji speaking sections, it had Yazidi as well as Sunni Muslims, and he also claims that the people of Dersim really belong to his tribe, so Alevis, all in one single tribe. So a tribe like the Mili is a conglomerate, a coming together of people of different origins, in a rather different way from the way people come together in an ethnic group. Nonetheless, in the course of time, the Mili became all Kurds. Nowadays, every Mili thinks that he is a Kurd. So, I asked the question in that article also, what makes an individual a Kurd? How does a person decide that he is a Kurd and not something else? And I have known many people who, in the course of their lives, have very consciously changed their own definition of what they were. But for some people, changing your identity is much easier than for others. So if you belong to a well-known, large Kurdish tribe, it is almost impossible to be something else but Kurd. Because it's a large tribe and they keep a genealogy. They know who your father, your grandfather, and so on. So you can't really change that. So this is a hard core of Kurdishness. Sunni tribes, the large Sunni tribes that have a history of many hundred years, they are of hard core that does not change very easily. There have been some cases where tribes that were moved to the Balkans or to Libya gradually changed, but even they maintain a memory of being Kurds. Also a person who is strongly moved by an ideological awareness that he is a Kurd. He is also a solid Kurd. Whatever his brother or his mother is, he is a Kurd. I think a person who, for political reasons, has decided to identify with the Kurdish nation, that is also a Kurd. But what about, let's say, Alevi, Kurmanji or Zazaki speaking Alevis? I've come across many Sunni Kurds who told me those people cannot be Kurds because they're not Sunni. They do all sorts of things that proper Muslims don't do, so they can't be Kurds. Just like the Yazidis cannot be Kurds. So in terms of definition by the other, they do not fit within the category of Kurds. According to their self-definition, there have been changes. Part of them thinks, and has always thought that they were Kurds. Part of them thinks that they are primarily Alevi. And as we know, since the 1980s, there has been a strong movement of defining a different nation from either the Zaza speakers or specifically from the Alevi Zaza speakers. It is not very widely supported, but it has been quite strong. So the idea that the Zazaki-speaking Alevis, who call themselves in their own language Kurmanj, are a people, and that their country therefore is Kurmanjiye, it's a competing nationalism with the nationalism of Kurdistan. So there are four different claims on some of the same territory. On the one hand, we have something that Zaza activists called Zazaistan, and there are maps of Zazaistan. We have Kurmanjiye, which is smaller, largely overlaps with Zazaistan, but it includes, it's only a part of Zazaistan. Then we have Kurdistan, which, in the view of Kurdish nationalists, of course, includes both the Zazas and all the, at least the Zaza or Kurmanji-speaking Alevis. And the dominant one has for a long time been the Turkish nation, of course. Now, this raises the question to what extent Kurdishness can be created. And especially, it doesn't need to be created for the hardcore, for the Sunni tribes, but perhaps it needs to be created for more marginal groups, like you have in all the towns and cities of Kurdistan. The old city population usually speaks Turkish, and surprisingly not Ottoman Turkish, but the form of Azeri. The Diyarbakir dialect is an Azeri dialect. Now, are these people what? What are they? Are they Turks? Are they Kurds? Many of them thought and think, are convinced that they are Kurds. But perhaps they needed some arguments. I mentioned the Zaza and the Alevi, but the most important group is those Kurds who do not belong to tribes, who are often in a subordinate position, who may be speaking either Zazaki or Kurmanji, who may have been in the past Armenians or Syrian Christians, or perhaps there have been so many different peoples in this country, many more than 47. Most of them have disappeared, but a few have remained. And among these non-tribal people, we find often the traces of earlier populations, or of tribes that have been conquered by other tribes, have been subjected, have been put into a dominant serf-like position where they were forced to work for the tribe. Now, the social theorists that help me to make sense, a little bit more sense, or to bring a little bit of organization into my data, I think the most important of them is Frederick Barth. He's also an anthropologist, and who, when he was doing research among the Pathan of Pakistan, he noted that in one part of Pakistan there are people who identify themselves as Pathan, but who have a very different culture from Pathan in another part. So in the mountains, in Swat, there are people who by the other Pathan are considered very, very strange. Their values contravene all the values that are said to be the typical values of the Pathan. But Barth said, when I talked to these other people, I could convince them that yes, they had to admit that the Pathan of Swat were also Pathans. There is something in Pathan, is that there may be cultural variety due to different ecological circumstances. But ethnic identity is not to be identified with the cultural stuff, but what makes people Pathan in that part of the world is the fact that there is a common consciousness of being a Pathan. There is some form of integration of Pathan community through communication and interaction. And especially there's this clear sense of what they are not. There is a boundary with other ethnic groups. So he, and this is a very old article, it's in 1969, and he proposes to redefine the ethnic group. There have been many attempts by anthropologists to define what an ethnic group is, and also in most of the early attempts, culture is one of the crucial elements. There is, of course, an awareness of being one group. It has to be a group, there has to be interaction within the group and communication within the group, which is only possible if you speak the same language. If you don't speak the same language, you cannot really communicate. Barth quotes, let's see, what is the order? He said, important is also that an ethnic group is biologically self-perpetuating. That makes them different, say, from a political association. They're families, and they have a history, and there will be a next generation of the same ethnic group. They are identified by themselves as distinct from similar groups. and also the outside considers them as different from similar groups. Now the new emphasis that Bart gives is we have to look at the boundary, at how groups maintain a boundary, and how it is possible to cross boundaries. The interesting thing is, of course, as a few examples that you gave me before, we have seen Kurds becoming Turks, Arabs becoming Kurds, and Arabs again, maybe. We see many individuals and sometimes entire tribes change their identity without this having an effect on the fact that Kurds still exist as a recognizable group and Arabs exist. The boundary remains, but people may cross the boundary. So how is the boundary maintained? Boundary maintenance is more or less the same as defining the nation. And this is what all nationalists do. They try to devise policies to sharpen the boundary, make the boundary harder, to include all those people within the boundary that they want to include, but you also have to exclude. So you have to make clear who does not belong there. There should be symbols that mark the boundary, a symbol that shows who's on the inside and who's on the outside. In Benedict Anderson's much later theory of nationalism, which he, in the book that he calls Imagined Communities, we find something of a similar idea, that the community, if it is an ethnic group or a nation, then it's not longer a face-to-face community. The community can only exist as an imagined community. And imagining the community means also imagining the boundary of your community. You cannot imagine a nation without imagining who does not belong to the nation, and without imagining what makes someone a member of that community. So this gives room to political entrepreneurs and inventors, but also to social scientists. Nationalists always, I mean, you cannot invent a nation at will, but you have to find some arguments to support that, to support the claim that this is your nation. And your nation needs to have proof of its historical existence. So history is very important for people who want to strengthen the sense of the nation. Now, using this idea of boundary and imagination, I looked again at the Kurdish society, at the dynamic that I found. And between tribes, we see quite strong boundaries. Every tribe has a clear sense of itself. It has a clear history. Many tribes keep genealogies, so they know who their ancestors are. There is a historical continuity, there's a cultural distinction. The interesting thing about Kurdish dialects is that dialects do not primarily belong to a region, like you find in many other cases, but most dialects are strongly correlated with a tribe. So if in one area you have 2 or 3 tribes who live through another, there's one village of one tribe, there's a village of the other, the dialect in the villages differs according to the tribe. You may find exactly the same dialect in different villages that are far apart, and in between you have different dialects. Nowadays you find the dialect spoken in Kurdahi, in northwest Syria, is exactly the same dialect you find spoken in the Caucasus, because tribes moved from there to Caucasus and they have maintained their dialect. So a tribe looks very much like what we used to think of as an ethnic group. It has its own culture, it has its language, distinctive. You can recognize a person. Well, nowadays, now that everyone has come to town, of course, things merge. But in the past, you would be able to recognize a person from the Kurdish that he spoke. You would say, ah, this is or she. She belongs to that tribe. because that is the dialect. Tribes maintained strong boundaries, but did not very often. Individuals switched from one tribe. There were conflicts and people moved to the stronger tribe. They joined the tribe as subaltern members. They became subjected to the dominant tribe, but they gained protection. Weak tribes were completely destroyed, meaning as an entity they disappeared, their members became either these non-tribal population that you see, or individually they joined different tribes. So there was enormous movement of people across the boundary between the tribes, but nonetheless tribes maintained a very strong identity until very recently. And even today, I think, in Ankara, I wouldn't know where to find a specific tribe, but I know there are certain apartments where everyone lives in nuclear families, but different apartments on the same floor have members of directly related families. So part of a tribe has an entire apartment complex. And although in the statistics it looks like the dominant form of living together in Turkey is the nuclear family, but many of these extended families and small tribes are in fact, even in towns, still living together. There was a time that when you wanted to take a taxi to the airport in Ankara, the taxi drivers all belonged to the same tribe. I don't think that exists anymore, but that was a time when it was fierce competition and the toughest guys won, so they had a monopoly over the taxi. Tribes have changed their functions. Detribalization already started before the Republic period, and in the 1930s it was strengthened. But then with democratization, tribes found new resources in politics. And the multi-party system of Turkey gave a new lease of life to the Kurdish tribes. A tribal chieftain could control the votes of his followers, so it was worthwhile for a political party to negotiate with a tribal chieftain or with a sheikh. And in the East, the elections are still, to a fair extent, controlled by that sort of patronage politics, which gave the chieftain access to power in Ankara, and perhaps also to patronage. He could challenge services, his medlef to the villages of his tribe. So tribes have interacted in a very interesting way with the state. Tribes in a way are shaped by their relationship with the state, and as this relationship changes, the structure of the tribes has also changed, but the tribes have not disappeared. But as we see also in political competition, the competition between different political parties, each of which has its own chieftain in a particular area, strengthened the conflict, the rivalry between these parties. So the boundary between the parties was strengthened at the time of elections. A harder boundary, I think, is the boundary between tribal and non-tribal, because if you're tribal, you belong to a certain elite, and the non-tribal people really look down upon. This was something that was used in a very important way by the PKK in its mobilization. I think Öcalan has often emphasized that he belongs to the non-tribal segment. The PKK has been very critical of all the other political organizations of Kurds, in which tribal chieftains or members of tribal leading families played important roles, by emphasizing that they are the only real proletarian movement. They are the only real nationalists, because a tribe cannot really be nationalist. It's only the people who have nothing to lose, who are the future, and who will be the ones that create the new Kurdistan. So this boundary played also in politics. The boundary still exists. Tribes were integrated into the political system. That was another kind of criticism of the PKK, of tribal chieftains. They collaborate with the political system. Non-tribal people are not integrated collectively, but individually. They need to find protection, they need to find patronage. They're also integrated, but in a different way from the tribes. Still looking at boundaries. To what extent is language a boundary? I believe that in the past, language distinction between Zazaki and Kurmanji was not very important. Many Zazas had learned some Kurmanji, and in communication they used Kurmanji. Kurmanji never learned Zaza, and there was this hierarchy. They say that Zazaki is more difficult, but anyway, Kurmanji never learned Zazaki. Many Zazas learned Kurmanji. One reason was also perhaps that in the medreses and in the Sunni Zaza areas, there are many medreses, education used also text in Kurmanji, but not in Zazaki. So, religion was a way in which the Zaza Sunnis and the Kurmanji Sunnis were integrated. The Sufi orders, the famous Sheikh Said, most of his followers belonged to the Zaza-speaking Sunni tribes of the region Erzurum, Bingöl, North Diyarbakir. But he had also followers among the Kurmanji speakers. And in the appeal of Sheikh Said to his followers, language never played any part. So language was not a very strong boundary. But, I mean, politicians can always try to strengthen boundaries, and we'll see that there have been a few cases in which enormous resources were diverted to strengthening this boundary. The state had an interest in strengthening this boundary. There's an interesting man called Hassan Rashid Tangout. No name?
Yes.
No, there's an important book that everyone who is interested in these issues should try to find. Mehmet Bayrak edited a collection of documents. What is it? Resmi, Gayri Resmi, or Gisli Belirli, in it, he reprints a number of articles by a man called Hassan Rashid Tangout, who was the commissioner for Eastern Anatolia for the Türk Ocakları, and later he became an expert at the Türk Dil Kurumu. He was one of those political activists, Turkcü political activists, who had hands-on knowledge of the region. He had traveled widely in East Anatolia. And he had this idea that in order to bring civilization to the Kurds, you have to Turkify them, of course. But there are so many of them. So it would be useful to first separate the Zazas from the Kurmanj, and then focus primarily on the Zazas, which is a smaller group. And once these are Turkicized, it will be easier to Turkicize the Kurmanj speakers. Even as late as 1961, after the military intervention of Cemal Gürsel, he sent a report in which he proposed literally creating a Turkish zone between the Zaza regions and the Kurmanji regions, in which people had to be, all Zaza and Kurmanj speakers had to be deported from that region and replaced by Turkish speakers, so that from that zone onwards, towards the north, the Zazas, and towards the south, the Kurmanj could be Turkicized. Now this is an extreme case. I don't think he has had much influence. But it is surprising that after another coup d'etat, 1980, there's this institute, the Türk Cultuur en Araştırma Institute, here in Ankara, manned mostly by retired army officers, I believe, and perhaps some intelligence officers. They started putting out a lot of books in which they emphasized not only that the Kurds are the Turks, as well the old ideology was, but also they emphasized the difference between Zazas and Kurds. Both are Turks, but they're in a different way to Kurds. At the same time, because of debates about identity, and because, well, perhaps because of the reaction of Zaza speakers towards Kurmanji nationalists who said, well, we need one single standard language for northern Kurdistan. You find that some Zaza speakers start thinking of themselves as not being Kurds altogether, but being a different nation. Primarily among the Alevis, Alevi Kurds have always felt hesitation to identify too closely with the Sunnis, because they remember their ancestors having had experienced a lot of violence at the hand of the Sunnis. The memory of Sunni-Alevi conflict and the revival of Sunni-Alevi conflict in the 70s strengthened this idea that Alevis, and especially Zaza-speaking Alevis, and Kurds cannot really be in the same nation. They cannot be the same people because of these violent conflicts. We had pogroms in 1978, 79. So, Zaza politicians try to find arguments for proving that the Zazas have always been a different people. And where do they find it? They go to the scholars. They go to the linguists and to archaeologists. And there are linguists who not only show that Zazaki, although it is also an Iranian language, it belongs to a different branch of the family of Iranian languages than Kurmanji. And there is also this theory, which is launched by a few writers in the early 19th century, that the Zaza have come because one of the other names for Zazaki is Dumeli. And Dumeli, say several people, may be derived from Dailami. Dailam is a region in northern Iran. And nationalists, Zaza nationalists, take these references from scholars and say, well, we are different people, we come from a different part. The Kurmanj come from a different part of the world, and we come from Dailam. The majority of our people also have a different religion. Our Alevism is very different from the Sunni religion. It's also different from the Alevism of the Turks. Well, I'll come back to this. Zaza and Alevi nationalism. There's a few interesting observations to make about another religious boundary. You would expect that the Islam-Christianity boundary was a very important one. And in fact, it is surprising to find people as different as Saidi Nursi in 1910 saying, this Kurdistan does not belong to the Turks, but it belongs to the Armenians and the Kurds. And a few years later, Abdullah Cevdet, the westernizer, the modernist, who incidentally was a close friend of Saidi Nursi. He was a-religious, but they were friends because they shared certain liberal ideas. And also this perception that Kurds and Armenians belonged in that region and were really brother people and could. Abdullah Cevdet, in one article in a Kurdish journal, even proposes to create a new nation consisting of Kurds and Armenians, so that the region does not have to be divided, so that you don't have to have an Armenia and a Kurdistan, but we have, like the Czechs and the Slovaks have Czechoslovakia, and so the Kurds and Armenians could have this, they could become one nation with one state. Now that's an old idea, but it's surprising to find some reverberations of this idea in the more recent ideological developments in the PKK. Their idea of democratic autonomy and of the incorporation of different ethnic groups without assimilating them, but recognizing their distinctness, but making them part of the same entity, seem a similar attempt to de-emphasize this religious boundary, to weaken the boundary, to make it less salient, less important. Now looking at the Alevis, if you go to the Ottoman Salname and you go to travelers' reports from the 19th century, they often mention various ethnic groups in eastern Anatolia. One ethnic group is Kurds, one ethnic group is Kızılbaş, as if they just another ethnic group like the Kurds, and what I find most surprising, Turks, of course, you have, and Muslims as an ethnic group. I do not know what to make of Muslims. I suppose Muslims means urban people. So Kızılbaş are people who live in Dersim and Varto and a few areas, one ethnic group. Kurds are the tribal people, and then you have Muslims and Turks. Some urban inhabitants, of course, self-identified as Turks, and others perhaps primarily as Muslim. Now, in the 20th century, everyone, well, when I first, in the 1970s, my first Alevi friends, when I asked them what is Alevism, they denied that it is a real religion. But Alevism for them was primarily a political identity, not a religious identity. Religion was something of the past. The Alevis had identified strongly with the Republic and its secularism. The Alevis were certainly not Muslims, not Sunni Muslims. If they had a religion or a philosophy, it was a humanistic philosophy, but the identity was primarily a progressive identity. Progressive in the Kemalist or in the socialist sense. And unsurprisingly, all left movements in Turkey had a very strong representation, over-representation of Alevis. It was as if religion no longer counted. A colleague of mine, Peter Boemke, an anthropologist, did fieldwork in Dersim in the 1970s, and he writes, Alevism in Dersim is a religion that is not practiced. People still have it as Alevism as an identity, but they don't practice it as a religion. It's not really a living religion. Now, in the 1980, the military coup forcibly depoliticized everything. Being a political movement became very dangerous. Most of the political activists now live in Europe, and those who remain behind really find themselves again as religious. And then they had to face different questions. Is Alevism different from Islam? Or is it within Islam? Is it a distinct religion? And so on. These are the questions that occupy contemporary Alevis. So, if you look at the Alevis as a group, we have seen them as an ethnic group, and then a political identity, and then again a religious group. Another anthropologist, Georg Elwert, wrote 20 years ago an article in which he said that this is not such a strange phenomenon in the world at all. We often find that not only ethnic groups may change their ethnic identity, but even the type of social formation that an ethnic group is may change. So he proposed to widen the definition of ethnic groups to we groups, of which the ethnic groups are a subsection. We groups are groups that have, like ethnic groups, boundaries and processes of boundary maintenance, boundary creation, boundary strengthening. They have a strong sense of identity, of self-identity, but also they are recognized by outsiders as a group. There is a historical continuity, but he said sometimes these groups are religious groups, which include speakers of many different languages. A religious sect maybe is a we group, but it's clearly not the same as an ethnic group. Or a political movement. And perhaps a Jamaat, is also a we group, which is clearly not what we usually think of as an ethnic group. It's also not a political movement, but it is also a Jemaat, the Jemaat that we have in Turkey nowadays, like Hizbullah, like the Nur Jemaat, like the Gülen Jemaat. They have a strong sense of identity, strong boundary. You cannot be a member of two Jemaat at the same time. If you, I can teach at the Gülen University because I don't belong there. But someone who belongs to a Nur Jemaat, to another Nur Jemaat, or who belongs to the Suleimanje, will never be accepted there because that's a competing Jemaat. There is a clear boundary. So, Jemaats are interesting for their boundary maintenance. Their effort to include people who are not yet part of, to draw people away from other Jemaats, but the non-acceptance of other Jemaat. It's very hard to find Jemaat cooperating for concrete issues. So Georg Elbert, speaking of V groups, says that in history there are several cases where we see one type of E group within a short period of time changing its character and becoming, say, he gives an example from a class-based political movement, a mass movement, becoming an ethnic movement. Or in another case, a class-based movement becoming a religious sect. And I think the Alevis provide a very interesting example. To what extent are the Alevis in Turkey nowadays an ethnic group, a religious community, a sort of Jemaat? The Alevis are especially interesting because the Alevis do not agree among themselves yet about how they go about it. But we see processes of this switching from one aspect to another. And we see that political entrepreneurs are the ones that carry out this process. If there is no political entrepreneurs, people who try to make political gains by mobilizing people on behalf of a particular identity, these shifts would not occur. They don't occur spontaneously. There is always people behind it. So the way to understand these processes, brings us to the theory of social movements. Some of you may be. Does social movement theory? Yeah, no. I was not planning to speak much about social movement theory. I thought that ethnicity and what resembles ethnicity is enough. You teach social movements well. You don't practice them, but you
She has also written a PhD dissertation. She's an activist academician.
Yes, well, I think social movement theory is, for certain aspects of these processes, it is a very useful tool, especially for the process of defining boundaries and persuading people that this is the proper boundary. Because you can say to a person, you are a Kurd, how you persuade these people that this is the case. Or someone who has all his life thought that he is a Kurd, how do you persuade him that he is really something else? Now, it helps if there are cultural resources that you can appeal to. If there is authority that you can appeal to. Like I said, the Zaza nationalists appealed to scholars, to linguists, to historians. Foreign scholars are more useful than local scholars. I am very useful, I have to admit. People have often thought that I might help them making a particular political claim, and I have often find it very, very difficult to stay away, because whatever I say about Zazas or Kurmanj, it may have an impact, because if a foreigner says it, it is somehow more persuasive, and certainly if this foreigner can refer to historical sources and so on. So resources, historical resources, making things plausible is very important. But then all the other things come. How do you mobilize people? There's various ways of mobilizing resources and mobilizing people behind this identity then. So the region that I'm presently most interested in is Dersim, because Dersim is so complex. Half of Dersim lives in Europe, and Dersim politics are also being played in Europe, which makes it more easy to observe from you. But in Dersim itself, you find the same. We have this old claim, which among the older generations still is very strong. Many Dersimi tribes, and especially many Sayyids in Dersim, genuinely believe that they come originally from Khorasan. There are myths in Alevi lore about Khorasan. Khorasan has a very prestigious name. And somehow, although, Fosi, you may know that Khorasan is not so Turkish. There are a few Turks, but not many. But somehow in Turkey, Khorasan has come to mean, so if you come from Khorasan, you're a Turk. So many Dersimis have long believed that they are Turks because they are from Khorasan. Even though they speak this strange language, Zazaki. And that, well, Republican administrators, the Balis of Elazığ, Erzincan, who have written about these issues, try to explain how come these Turks speak a language that is not Turkish. And they must have learned Zazaki from whom would they have learned it? There must have been people who spoke Zazaki before the Turks came, after all. So the Turkish claim of identity is perhaps not so strong, and I think the younger generation overall does not really buy into Turkish identity anymore. The PKK had a journal for in Europe, especially focusing on Kurdish Alevis who were thinking that they're perhaps not Kurds. And in the masthead, the journal, it had the slogan.
Aslında inkar eden aramdadır.
Yeah, implying that this Asıl could only be Kurdish. But many young academics from Dersim, educated either in Turkey or in Europe or the United States, have gone back and done oral history research interviewing the old people. I mean, the Mehmet Kemal Karaman have a few CDs even using some of this oral history material, investigating what old people remember of the history. Inspired by identity debates in Europe, friends of mine went back to this and they asked their grandfather, what are we really? And it depended on the language in which they asked the question, what sort of answer they got. Because the languages do not divide up people in the same way. So, there is an active production of a Dersim identity. It seems that most Dersimis now are finding that the Dersimis are a group all by itself. Their language, they share the language with people from elsewhere, some of whom are Sunnis, who are definitely different. I mean, Sunni and Alevi does not really mix well. Even among highly secularized friends of mine, marriage between an Alevi and a Sunni is still pretty different, pretty difficult. Political activists have found it hard to persuade their family, even if they're activists within the PKK, which does not want to recognize these distinctions. They find it hard to persuade their family that they could marry someone across that boundary. It's a very active boundary. Doing oral history research and trying to prove the identity of Dersim, showing how religious traditions of Dersim are really very different from the sort of Alevism of the Bektashis of the Kızılırmak region, is helping up to build up a boundary around the Dersim identity. Among the other social theorists that I wanted to mention, I think I have to round off, but I want to mention one big name. Rogers Brubaker is an American sociologist who has written a lot about nationalism and identity, and he has, his most recent work speaks of ethnicity without groups. So all the time we've been speaking about ethnic groups, and he says, well, once we speak about ethnic groups, the very term may mislead us to think that what we're talking about are actual groups. We listen to people speaking on behalf of those groups, like the Kurds or the Zazas or the Alawis. They have activists who speak on behalf of the group, and they may give the impression that there is such a group, but this awareness may not be shared. So he said, ethnicity exists, Alawi ethnic identity exists, Kurdish ethnic identity exists, Zaza ethnic identity exists, and maybe either part of Kurdish ethnic identity or something beside it. But that does not mean that all Zazas or all Kurds or all Alawis actively feel part of that same group. More or less, because everything is more or less. A boundary is more or less strong. An identity is more or less consistent. Many individuals emphasize different identities in different times of the day. There's a famous quote in Marx's thesis on Feuerbach about someone being a fisherman in the morning and a peasant in the evening. I forgot it. Are there any who has Marxist scholarship? Depending on the context, if someone from Dersim speaks to a German in Germany, he is primarily a Turk, a Turkish immigrant. If he speaks to a Turkish immigrant in Turkey, he is primarily, well, that's not so clear. It depends on what sort of Turk it is. But he may be a Kurd, or he may be an Alawi, or maybe it is the context that defines which aspect of the identity becomes more important. And most people have multiple identities. Even if you belong to the hardcore of Kurdish tribes, you may have different identities that at other times, in different contexts, you emphasize. And I think the most interesting phenomenon that is strengthened in these years of AKP rule, I don't know to what extent this is in fact an impact of politics. The Cemaats have become much more significant in Kurdish politics. If you go to the Diyarbakir politics, PKK is very strong. And PKK, it's side organizations. But one of the important symbols of Kurdish identity is the Nowruz celebration of PKK of the Kurds, of those who speak on behalf of the Kurdish nation. On the 21st of March. A month later, there is a similar manifestation called the Kutlu Haftar. And the numbers of people coming there are almost as large as the number of people coming to the Nowruz celebrations. The Kutlu Haftar is organized by what we know as Hezbollah, or its legal branch, the Hudapar, or the broader Jemaat. Hezbollah was a political movement. It started as a very small political movement. Part of it was used by JITEM and intelligence services against the PKK in the 1980s, 1990s. But gradually it has transformed itself. It has become a Jemaat, which has a hard core, but also a very large periphery, a large following, which can be mobilized. It is capable of mobilizing enormous amounts of people. They're not the only Jemaat. Sufi orders have always been strong among the Kurds, the Naqshbandi especially, and there's now this one branch of the Naqshbandis, Menzil, which has been branching out. They're even active in Indonesia. They have gone transnational. There is a Menzil Medrese in Indonesia. There's many, in my town in Utrecht, there is a derga of Menzil. Everywhere. In Istanbul, I hear from people doing research in lower class neighborhoods, the strongest organization among the Kurds is Menzil Jemaat. They're also very strong in Kurdistan. So this is different. This is no longer a political party. They do not speak about Kurdishness so much, but they're very Kurdish. I mean, they communicate in Kurdish. They do not accept the definition of Kurdishness that the PKK gives, but they're clearly rival to the PKK, and they're modeling themselves on the PKK. You might say that as a result, PKK is also, and when I say PKK, I mean everything including the legal organizations. I mean, they have an impact on the PKK. PKK has also started organizing its own Kutludoum Stoplantenaren, which were less successful than those of Hezbollah. So I think as a social formation, the Jemaat is a fascinating new phenomenon. Right, the Jemaat is different from an ethnic group, different from a political movement. It has a very clear authority structure, very authoritarian. The Muslim Brotherhood is the archetype of the Jemaat. It has core members, and all the core members have gone through a period of initiation, ideological training, and they have to prove that they belong, and they're constantly being tested. There's a very, very strong peer pressure, a process of imposing social conformity. And of course, mutual help. Being a member of a Jemaat can be a great help if you're in difficult circumstances. They can help you to find a place to live, they can help you to find work, and so on. A very useful resource for people. There's numerous peripheral members who have not yet gone through the initiation process, but they are sympathizers, and they may perform certain services for the Jemaat. And as I said before, there is a strong boundary maintained by the core group vis-à-vis other Jemaat. Like Frederick Barth said about ethnic groups, I mean, the important thing of ethnic groups is that it maintains a boundary with similar organizations. So it's the boundary between ethnic group and another ethnic group, not between an ethnic group and a political party, or an ethnic group and a religious organization, but it's a boundary between similar types of social structure. So I think we can see the Jemaat as a relatively new phenomenon in Kurdish society, structuring, organizing Kurdish society. I would say that the tribes are becoming more and more insignificant. In the 1970s, they were very prominent in politics as well. But there was a revival of the tribes at the time of the violent struggle between the PKK and the state, because the state mobilized tribes against the PKK. Korucu tribes really revitalized the tribal system. And surprisingly, these tribes were not only tribes, they were also very Kurdish. The Korucus, although they were mobilized by the state, had a very strong sense of Kurdishness. They were the first people to wear Kurdish clothes. Kurdish clothes had long been banned in Turkey, but the first groups that you could see wearing Kurdish dress were the Korucu. Not the PKK, they have a uniform, which is different. And very surprisingly also, from the 1990s onwards, in elections, many Korucu villages voted for HDP and all those parties. So, surprisingly, the mobilization of the tribe was also a mobilization of Kurdish awareness, even among those who were fighting against the movement that was also inciting this Kurdish awareness. Now, something similar happens to the Jemaat. The Jemaat, when you ask them directly, they deny that ethnicity is important. In Islam, that doesn't count. We are all brothers. The important thing is to be Muslims. But, well, the Nur Jemaat, the Nur movement, had many followers among Turks as well as among Kurds. The largest and most successful of the Nur Jemaat, the Gülen Jemaat, in 1980 supported the military coup, although Gülen himself had to remain in hiding for 3 years. They supported, and they had this very Turkish nationalist discourse, so that many Kurdish Nurcu said, well, this is not proper Nurculuk, this can't be Nurculuk, and they became more Kurdish. So we have various Kurdish Nurji groups who are Muslims primarily, but I mean the subtext is always, but we must be Turks, we Kurds. A small group that publishes a journal, Nubahar, they are Kurdish Nurjus, and they are, well, they see as their identity Kurdish as well as Islamic, and most other Kurds consider them, I think it's the one Kurdish group that is very highly respected among all other Kurds, including the PKK, because they're very good Kurds. And they're very good Muslims. They do not claim that Kurds are essentially different, but they have this Kurdish culture. They come from a madrasa culture. They cultivate Kurdish writing. Similarly, Hezbollah. Many of my secular Kurdish friends say, Hezbollah can't be. How can Kurds be Hezbollah? This is a movement organized by the Turkish state. Well, until you meet Hezbollah people. Because I was in Diyarbakir last year and I spoke to Hezbollah people and I was asking about Kobani. The big struggle had not yet begun. But everyone said, oh great, our people are fighting against ISIS. Hezbollah people said, our people, meaning, yeah, the people of Kobani, are fighting against ISIS. I said, but I heard that some of your people joined the struggle in Syria to fight against Assad. I said, yes, yes, not only Hezbollah, all Jemaats have sent people to Syria, first to Ahrar al-Sham or to al-Nusra, and many of them ended in fact up in ISIS. But many of the rank and file of Hezbollah identified more strongly with Kobani than with ISIS. Now, I don't think my PKK friends realize that because they find it very hard to distinguish one type of Muslim from another. But, I mean, the Jemaat situation is very complex. So the Jemaat is a very important new color within Kurdish identity to recognize. And I think it is there to stay and it will be increasingly important. I think I've spoken enough. I have a few other points, but they may come up in the discussion. Thank you for your attention. Yes, whatever you want. I mean, some people might want to leave, give people who want to leave the opportunity to leave, and then we continue the discussion. Yeah, okay, yes, people might go.
Okay, we'll give 10 minutes break, then for the discussion we'll meet up again.
Yok, kapat. Tamam. Several hundred questions.
Bunları merge edebilecek miyiz biz ya?
Okay,
Zaten şey başladık ya.
So, anyone who wants to raise points, ask questions, please.
Actually, I have two questions, but just fair, I ask one question first. Relating to the argument from frontier studies, when it comes to the eastern part of Kurdistan, we don't really see enough studies, especially from the classical period, from 15th to 19th centuries. And what do you think the exact reason, or what kind of reasons that we don't really see enough studies about the region? So for the Balkans, we have enough studies actually. For Egypt, maybe we can say. But I don't really see enough studies when it comes to the region. And this is actually my question. But I will ask the second one if I ask. And the second one is related to using the term the tribe. I will see it very problematic to use for all sections of the tribes. Even the other sources use kabile or ashiret, oymak, or the same tribe from
or
different...
Cemaats.
Yeah. So actually some other anthropologists discussed this topic. What kind of approach we should use when it comes to the Kurdish tribes, especially for the 19th or early 20th centuries?
Well, the first question, I think, is more like, it seems to suggest an answer. You think there must be some reason why the social history of the region we now know as Kurdistan was understudied in Turkey. I think I agree with you. It was, for your academic career, it was probably better to study the Balkans than to study the Kurds. That's a very concrete reason. And I think even today, that is still valid. I think even today, students who are writing a PhD thesis will have to reflect, do I want to invest all this time in writing a thesis that might be stigmatizing me later in my academic career? Or should I write about a safe subject first, trying to get myself into the academic establishment, and only then start doing the things that I really find important or interesting? As academics, we always have to operate in a political environment, and certain issues are very sensitive, and it demands great courage and determination. Not everyone is Ismail Bashikci, who dedicated his life to a struggle. For some people, the struggle is important. Other people want to do an academic career, and then they often take the wise route of studying something else first. I tell my own students, first learn your craft, learn how to do anthropological research. And you can do that on a less risky topic. But you have to learn, you have to establish yourself as a person who has skills and who is respected as a scholar. Once you have that respect, then you can turn to the Kurds. I think I tell my students as a strategy. But many of them, of course, feel that it's so important to assert their own identity that they prefer immediately start their career. So that's one. And the second, why do I use this one term, tribe? On the one hand, Ottoman sources do not use the terms consistently at all. So it makes little sense to make a distinction between what is a kabile and what is an ashiret. There is no systematic difference in the Ottoman sources. The use of the language, the use of the term, sometimes differs from region to region. So I find it better to speak just of tribes, but I try to show that even among Kurdish tribes, you have very different types of tribes. You have on the one hand the relatively democratic, homogeneous tribe in which everyone else's relative, and there is no automatic superior person. That at best there is you have some respi, and perhaps there is a strong chieftain, but normally the strong chieftains you don't see in these smaller tribes. They're relatively egalitarian. And then you have tribes of increasing complexity, and the really large tribes like the Jaf or the Herki or the Jelali. They have a number of sections, which in the literature are sometimes called clan, or that you might call kabine, which is a section of a confederacy. And some of these sections have a higher position, higher power, own more land, own more sheep, can control the labor of others. So, like the Herki, they have a clan called Begzade, the children of the Beg, of the Bey. They are the feudal layer of this tribe. It used to be a nomadic tribe, but the Begzade were really the ruling stratum. Then you had nomadic tribes that were classed under the Begzade, and then you had peasant groups which were also somewhat tribally organized. They belonged to the Herki, but more or less in a way like an Aga in Martinussi or so might speak of Verlehimen, my Christians. I mean, they belong to my tribe because I own them, I control their labor, I can tell them to leave the land, or I can forbid them to leave the land. They do not have complete freedom. There was a subject population that belongs to the tribe but is not a member in the same way as the nomadic members of that tribe. So a stratified society. So from egalitarianism to a very complex feudal stratification exists in different types of tribes. And it's due to the interaction with the state, I think, that these higher forms of complexity exist, come into existence, or also disappear. Tribes, the Kurdish tribes, have never been entirely independent entities. The position of a chieftain in a tribe depends not only on how he can impose his will on other members of his tribe, by mediating in conflicts, by showing himself to be a very met and meer, a very generous and a very courageous man. But the most important thing for the tribal chieftain has always been how to deal with the state, how to keep the tax collectors a little bit away, how to make sure that your tribe is not forced into the armed forces, how you can get certain privileges from the state, and so on. That's the major skill the tribal chieftain needs. The better the skills, the larger his tribe will become. So a tribe is a very dynamic something. Tribes are not things that are always the same. They respond to political circumstances. You find some tribes like the Jav that I've been followed over time, say within 1 century, it's moved in size from 700 tents to 2,000 tents, to 3,000 tents, to 500 tents. Due to political events, they were in a battle, the animals were taken away, or people were killed, or entire sections of tribes deserted and made themselves independent from the modern tribe. Or later, when there was a successful man, he could bring people from different neighboring tribes together and join them under his own leadership. So we have many different types of tribes, but I still do not see that using different terms makes it more easy to speak about these different terms, because every term has been used in the literature in too many different senses. So I keep it as simple as possible and just tell the reality is complicated. The name, I don't care much about it. You have someone else?
Okay, thank you for your presentation. During your presentation, you mentioned the concept that detribalization, and you argued that the importance of the tribes are getting decreased. But in your answer to this question, you told that tribes are also very dynamic structures, formations. So, I mean, don't you think that tribes are not getting decreasing? I mean, their importance are getting decreasing, but they are transforming themselves and integrating to modernization and the modern state.
Yes, they're definitely transforming themselves, but a few things are very important. I think traditionally in a tribe, marriage relations are within the tribe. Tribes are endogamous units. The preferred membership is your cousin, your father's brother's daughter. And in fact, in villages where I've been, I found that 40 to 50% of the marriages were in fact such marriages. Marriages between first cousins. And if you count all different cousins, it might be up to 70% of the marriages that were with cousins. And most of the other marriages were within the same, not only the same tribe, but the same section of the tribe. So endogamy is very important. And I think that is changing very much with, certainly with urbanization. Even though tribes may find new economic functions to serve as a safety net for their members, as a provider of living, even if mutual visiting remains still very important. I think many of the younger members of the tribe make their own choices about whom to marry. The exception is perhaps of the leading families of tribes. The leading families of tribes have often married for political purposes. They made political alliances for marriages. So they often did not marry their cousin, but they married someone of another tribe in order to forge an alliance between the tribes. Nowadays, many leading families feel that they, as the leaders of the tribe, need to symbolize the unity of the tribe, and they members of the leading families may be less free to choose a marriage partner than the common members. And there may be, again, pressure from the rest of the family to make a convenient alliance with another important tribe, or to marry into a political family, or to marry with a cousin, because cousin marriages remain important also among the leading strata. So they may be less free than ordinary members of tribes. So we may see that the leading stratum of the tribe maintains its tribal identity for a longer period than the commoners.
I mean, I remember your example of taxi drivers.
Yes.
During my field work, it's told me that one of the section or the department of Kızıltepe Devlet Hastanesi composed of one tribe. Yeah. So this fact says me that I mean the importance of tribes are not getting decreased, but you know it's, as I told, you know, trying to integrate itself to the modernity and the state itself.
Well,
I mean this is a transformation.
Patronage relations will always remain, and patronage relations may follow tribal lines. They may also use different forms. But it is true that if someone has the possibility of appointing the staff of this Devlet Hastanesi, he will appoint his own relatives, yes. If he happens to be a member of a political movement that is not tribal, he might have appointed members of his political movement or of his religious association. And we see that Cemaats now control some universities, they control many different institutions. We see that type of patronage relationships now being practiced primarily by Cemaats rather than the tribes. So it is an option that the tribes have. And as I said, sometimes the state may feel the need to revive the tribes, as in the time when Korucu units were being formed. But I believe that the overall social change, the urbanization, the much looser relations between young people, easier contacts between young men and young women, higher education, they work to lower the degree of tribal solidarity overall. But I may be proven wrong. I may be asked here again in 10 years' time and have to tell you that yes, tribes are important.
In this connection, I have a question actually. Now you have mentioned in the recent situation that in the area there develops on the influence of which increases the Cemaats and a political party PKK in connection with its additional organizations, and the fading away of the importance of the tribes. Now what makes me think about Previously, we used to think about tribes as if they were social conglomerations based upon kinship relationships. Now, we have learned that kinship functions just perhaps at most as an idiom explaining the world of social relations, but no more. And your example as well has shown that actually kinship is just fictive, if there is any. And in most of the cases, there may not be as well. Nobody needs to prove that kind of relationship for the claim to belong to a tribe any longer. Then, what makes me think is this, for instance, in Turkish politics, when I was working on it for several years ago, I thought that Turkish politics, actually, behind the facade, its appearance, functions as a kind of tribal organization. So, what makes within this connection, however, that was my difficulty, tribe-specifically different from the other V groups or patronage groups? What do you think about it?
Yes, I mean, political parties, and especially political movements like we saw in the 1970s, they had also this strong tendency towards endogamy, and the party leadership defined who you were allowed to marry or not to marry. So they started functioning in a way like a tribe. I think a tribe has a name and it has symbols of a deep historical past. That is important. Very often a tribal name refers to a distant ancestor. Jalali is the tribe of Jalal. Haidaran is the tribe of a certain Haidar. Many core members of the tribe remember their genealogies. It is true that kinship is an ideology, but it is the ideology of the tribe, but the fact that it is an ideology does not contradict the fact that many people are really the ancestors of people who were members of the same tribe several generations ago. The vast majority may be, in fact. There may be people who join, but they have always joined in it when they come to the tribe, they join in a lower status, and only when they manage to marry into a more powerful family are they becoming fully recognized as a member of the tribe. The other B groups are perhaps less strictly organized in terms of organization of marriage, and in this specific, what anthropologists call the splitting up of a tribe in smaller descent groups. A tribe consists of a number of clans. Every clan consists of a number of sub-clans. Every sub-clan consists of a number. And you can make a picture, it's like a pyramid. And I think no other type of organization has exactly that structure. The splitting and alliance within the tribe, which you see in active when there is a conflict, when there is a blood feud between sections of the tribe, you see that they mobilize the largest number of relatives. I think that is a type of structure that distinguishes the tribe from the other B groups. Now, ethnic groups, I think my presentation has shown that ethnic group is a very difficult label, because I might well try to give you arguments that the Alevis are a ethnic group, but they are a bit different as an ethnic group from the Cherkess in Turkey. The Cherkess in Turkey are a very unproblematic ethnic group, I think. There's little ambiguity about the Cherkess, because they're immigrants, basically, or descendants of immigrants. But people who have very deep historical roots, it's much more complicated. A religious sect is a very good example of a different type of a B group. It has very strong solidarity, very strong boundaries, it may not be difficult to get in, but very difficult to get out if they are a cult group. And they try to keep you in, and they kidnap you, they keep you imprisoned if you want to leave. Sects believe that they're the only ones who have the real truth, and they're different from anyone else. So yes, there is a strong boundary around them. They function very much like a tribe, but they have a different internal structure. And I think the Cemaats is the only important element that does not have this structure of splitting that the tribe has. The tribe has this natural, because they reckon themselves into descent groups who can ally and split in conflicts. I mean, the tribe, the Cemaat is not structured like that. Your position in the Cemaat does not really depend much on who your father is. Well, yes, very often they know who someone's father or grandfather was, and it is important, but it's only one of many other factors. If your grandfather was one of the people close to Said Nursi, that gives you a very strong position within the movement. Even like we have recently seen in the Gülen movement, some people left the movement and started acting against it. People found it very hard to criticize it because they were the grandsons of a particular Abi who was very close to them, who was loved by Said Nursi. So dissent, even in a Jamaat, may become important, but it's not certainly not the only or the major factor that determines the type of position a person has.
Can we think about the succession problem in Jamaat, for instance? Don't think about the giving hand or who your benefactor is, teacher is. So that you are the student or follower of this important man in Jamaat, and up to a certain point in history when there emerge reasons for a clash, internal clash, you begin to another movement. For instance, look at the Nurcu movement. Yeah. That has been already divided into I don't know how many sections. Okay. How that it was possible for these men, Gülen for instance, to initiate a movement? If there were yeah, maybe not the actual relationships of kinship and descent, but kind of transmission of the religious authority this time.
Yeah, well, succession is a very difficult matter in the Jamaat. Like the Ottoman Empire had problems with succession, and they had to take, of course, very drastic measures to make sure that the succession was successful. The same is true in the Gülen movement. Many members of the Gülen movement, including permanent members, have asked me, what do I think will happen when Gülen dies? I don't know, I asked them. Nobody knows, and nobody is supposed to know. But as soon as we know who is the successor, Gülen becomes irrelevant. And everyone will start looking at the successor and try to establish a relationship with him. So he cannot say who is going to succeed him. And you find it in all the Jamaats. No leader of a Jamaat has appointed a successor. There are people around him, Abis around him, and there's a lot of speculation about who is closest, to whom he listens, but it's all speculation. There's a lot of speculation. But until the end, it is not determined who will succeed him. And the same may happen to the Gülen movement as happened to the original Nur movement. It falls apart into a number of movements, each with their member who has the legitimacy of having been close to, in the first case, Said Nursi, or now close to Gülen. There's a number of people who can claim to have been very, very close to him. Some of them are currently at the other side of the political spectrum. Yes?
You talked about Zazas and how they shifted actually. I think they have a quite shifting identity over the process. Right? They were in the 70s. They were probably all concerned with the class issues, and they were leftists. Then they became Kurds, and then they became Alevis, and then they realized there was something else, and they became Zazas. And you mentioned that you mentioned two aspects to it. One was, for instance, that Cemal Tankut and Zaza movement as a political project, perhaps, you know, initiated by the Turkish state itself. Or you also said that, you know, the Kurdish movement said, okay, let's have this one language, and from that aspect we can think that Zazas said, you know, at some point, we're not Kurds, we're speaking another language, why can't we become this, you know, unique ethnic identity? So I was wondering, what's your perspective on this? Like, to what extent it's a political project of the state, to what extent it's a natural shifting of an identity in the case of the Zazas, and especially in Dersim?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for this question, because I do not want anyone to believe that I have heard that I said that the Zaza identity is a creation of the Turkish state. I definitely did not want to say that.
I'm not saying that
No,
you
no,
told
I know.
it, but Hassan
I want
is a great
I
example.
want to emphasize this.
Many people say that.
No, but I did want to emphasize is that boundaries between ethnic groups can to some extent be made and unmade. They can be constructed, they can be strengthened, they can be denied, and the process of boundary making, boundary maintenance, and boundary destruction is a political process carried out by political actors. But you cannot make just any boundary. In order to be credible, there has to be some cultural resources to make it credible. So, in the case of the Zaza-Kurmanj boundary, it is useful that the languages or the dialects are rather different, although do you speak a dialect of any language?
Probably.
I think it's even true for Turkish dialects. I mean, Turkish dialects from one place to another may differ. But if I, as a speaker of one dialect, meet a speaker of another dialect, I can speak my dialect in two different ways. I can speak it in such a way that he more or less understands what I say. I can bring my dialects by the choice of words, by the intonation, and so by the way I speak, I can make the other person help to understand me, or I can speak my dialect in such that he absolutely doesn't understand anything. And the same is true between Zazaki and Kurmanji. Some Zazas can speak Zazaki in a way that the Kurmanj may understand more or less what is being said. Kurmanj can also make their dialect sufficiently understandable to Zaza. So there is enormous flexibility. But once the structure of the language is written down, the phonology, the morphology is studied by comparative linguists, it seems to be shown without a doubt that they do belong to different branches of the Iranian languages. So that as languages they may have a different history. Now languages and people may of course move completely independently. A language may disappear, but the people still stay there. So if people speak a different language from their neighbors today, it does not mean that they have originally different origins. They have always been different. That's not necessarily the case. There may have been certain processes that made them speak this one dialect and their neighbors spoke a different dialect. Migration must be part of the explanation, but not necessarily migration from very far. So, very much has been made of the linguistic difference. I'm not sure if I can follow the track of my own thoughts now. I was going to say something very complicated, but
go ahead.
No, Zaza activists who, for whatever reason, and it may be simply competition, they cannot make it in the big movement, so they make a small movement. You often see that, and they want to be the leaders, but they may have different motivations, but they can at least appeal to certain resources, certain somewhat objective written sources about language, perhaps speculations by scholars about history, which make their claim that the Zazas are different a credible claim. Now, whether it will be able to mobilize people behind that claim is a different matter. And that may depend very much on the political circumstances. It may also depend on what one can gain by being a Zaza rather than a Kurmanj. I mean, if you can gain a job by being a Zaza and not being a Kurmanj, I mean, there's a strong incentive to emphasize my Zaza-ness. If, on the other hand, all the jobs are for Kurds, there's a strong incentive to emphasize my Kurdishness. And having a somewhat ambivalent identity may be very useful for people because it gives them room to negotiate. So, yes, identities are variable, the boundaries can be strengthened and weakened. People may accept my claim about a boundary or not, and it depends very much on political processes. And the state is only one of many actors in this process. Just when I was losing myself, suddenly the thought came into my mind that many Armenians in that region used to have Kurdish as their mother tongue. Now, what are these people? Are they Kurds who happen to be Christians? Are they Armenians who happen to speak Kurdish? Do they represent an original Armenian-speaking Kurdish people or whatever? I mean, for those people, there are a number of potential identity claims. They have a number of different identities with which they can ally themselves. By the time everyone speaks only one language, all these possibilities have disappeared. But in the past, many people spoke many languages, and I think it is great. It is wonderful to have multiple identities. So, if anything that I said, that I want to have remembered by is that variety is beautiful, and having much variety in yourself is a great richness. It's a great treasure. Yes?
Yes, thank you. Many thanks for your talk, dear Professor. I'm a little bit shifting the context. I would like to learn more about the geopolitical role that tribes play in contemporary Middle East, especially in the Iraqi context, and especially in the rise of ISIS.
Yes.
How would you assess their role?
You're speaking about Arab tribes now.
Arab tribes,
yeah.
like Sunni tribes,
yeah.
and their role in the empowerment of ISIS in Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean for modern politics, modern state-tribe relations? How would you assess it?
Wow. That's a different kettle of fish.
Yes.
I do not know whether I have any original observations that you have not already read. You seem to be interested in case you have read a lot about it. So you know that ISIS is a very complex formation which has an ideological core, which really believe in the things that they say. And then there's all these people that in Iraq they have drawn into because they feel they've been alienated by the American intervention when all Saddam's institutions were destroyed, and the people who had functions in these institutions, who had security of life, of work, lost everything they had. And they've been looking for something secure. And the only thing that arrives on the horizon is this new ISIS. So there's many people who joined ISIS because it is the only credible alternative for Sunni Arabs to find a protective umbrella and to maintain control of their own land and perhaps get rid of this Sykes-Picot Treaty and unite with a larger group of Sunni Arabs. To what extent the tribes as tribes play a role, I'm not so sure. The ISIS ideological leadership certainly is not in favor of tribalism. And tribes have independent power. Tribes are potentially a threat. A tribe may, as long as it remains a tribe, may from one day to the other turn against it, make an alliance with Baghdad. So ISIS leadership will certainly try to marginalize the role of tribal political leaders as much as possible. And they may, to the extent that they have not already done so, physically destroy the tribal leadership but try to keep the tribe, the tribal members. And they might try to become something like what the Cemaats are doing in Turkish Kurdistan. Present themselves as a perhaps more modern and perhaps more useful framework for representing common interests. So ISIS is also a Jemaat, it's very successful and very military Jemaat. It's perhaps a very radical example of the same phenomena that I saw developing in Turkey. So yes, my speculation would be Arab tribes will be weakened by the growth. On the other hand, there will be many. The Americans have enormous resources at the disposal of tribes if they can organize their followers. So the same phenomenon of the Korucu in Turkey revitalizing the tribes may, perhaps, we don't know, the speculation, the possibility exists.
Thank you for the interesting talk. I'm wondering to what extent the elements of particularism and universalism, you didn't frame them in these terms, but when you talk about egalitarianism, it sounds like it's a principle of more universalist, inclusive idea. And on the other hand, when you talk about stratification, it seems emphasis on particularism. The reason that I'm asking that is that in my field work with religious minorities, I see there is a constant, maybe this is the animating force in the formation of their identity, there is a constant back and forth. At the same time, they want to maintain distinctiveness, Zoroastrians in Iran. There is an element of universalism, but it is expressed in a way that we have contributed these ideas and these theories not only to the Shia, to the Sunnis, but to the world. But there is a very fine line not to dilute their distinctive identity while they have a universalist claim. I'm wondering to what extent you observed this struggle to incorporate these elements in their principles of self-identification.
It's interesting. I was speaking of egalitarian tribes, small tribes being, but not egalitarianism. Egalitarianism is an ideology saying that people should be equal. In a tribe, in a small tribe, people happen to be equal. Not because it's good or bad, but it just happens to be the case. Some political movements, of course, have been fighting in the name of egalitarianism against hierarchical tribal structures. The PKK is the prime example. They have found themselves having to negotiate with tribal chieftains as well. But the basic impulse is still a very strong egalitarian impulse. Egalitarian, class egalitarian also between different religious sects and groups, and even egalitarianism between different ethnic groups, like we see now in Syria. Although the Christians have had their difficulties with the administration of the canton of Kamishli, the Jazira. Right now, the Christian militias are strongly supported by the PYD in the name of the organizing principles of democratic autonomy, in which people of all levels of the local level can organize on the basis of local interests and can find the support of confederated groups. So you find now Syriani militias being supported by the Kurdish militias together fighting against ISIS. On the other hand, I think that small religious groups like Ahli Haq, and perhaps the most radical example is the Yazidis, cannot afford to be egalitarian. On the one hand, they have hereditary religious functionaries, Sayyids, and the Yazidis have three different classes, or four different classes of religious specialists. But especially, they cannot afford to believe that all humans are equal. As a Yazidi, you're not allowed to marry someone who's not Yazidi. And even people who have been very high up in the PKK will not marry a non-Yazidi. I mean, that is the one, because they feel if Yazidis start marrying non-Yazidis, it's the end of the existence of Yazidis. They feel that they're fighting a battle to maintain their identity as a distinct group, and they can only protect it if they make sure that everyone marries another Yazidi instead. So they cannot accept universalism would mean assimilation, disappearance. So they're against universalism. The interesting thing is that the Ahli Haq, of course, have this discourse about our values are universal values, unlike the values of the guys who are ruling in Tehran. But I mean, in practice, I think you'll also see they have the same idea of having the cohesion of the community of the Taifa as their important focus. They do not want the Taifa to dissipate. And they do not want to recognize other religious groups as equal in the sense as marriageable.
The declining number of these small minority groups, it's a matter of survival. And many scholars have argued that Zoroastrians will disappear in 100 years. You just can calculate. And I think it's the same with Yazidis. And it's always, I'm wondering, even the survival, the very physical survival of the community, it seems doesn't bring them to innovate or create a principle of incorporation. Like let's say, if you marry other groups through your father, we can incorporate that family into our group. So if they expand, it stops survival. Why that doesn't happen? Any thought on that?
Well, I'm sure that I'm not the person to answer that question. I'm not a member of any of these groups. So. I thought you had a question. No?
I just want to share my confusion about this.
Have I made you more confused?
No. You're just clarifying this. My confusion comes from another reference, actually. It's like Orlando Patterson in the US context was like saying, why do we use this race and ethnicity like separation in the context of US? Because in the end, I mean, in their like population surveys and so forth, there's a racial category, then there's an ethnic category, like Hispanics and so forth. So at the moment in the US, nobody can make a biological racism in the contemporary world. So that part is gone. So actually, what we are saying in the like racial formation is more like the cultural differences we are trying to locate how to define. So then, like we have to call all of them ethnicity, like he was saying, and not like the like racial group, but ethnicity is the culture. And now, I mean, with your empirical data, like it's clear there is no cultural substance that really keeps any kind of group. I mean, like they're all like fluctuating. I mean, not like language, not really common language. It's always like redefined and so forth on that basis. But they are also like not working de facto like race worked once on the biological matter as well. So how that is now like in general you are not able to make biological racism and turn into like cultural racism and so forth like discussion. I mean in the end like changing the substance there from biology to culture did not change that much the effects of the ethics and like social organization and so forth. So there are all the kinds of substances are changing. So I mean, and with the like new theories and so forth, like you mentioned as well, the substance itself we are not able to go through that. So like through the relations and so forth, we are going like I mean, Levi-Strauss in the end in the exchange principles he finds all the formation of the like tribes and so forth. Then like about the boundaries, like we are not talking about the substance at all, but certain relations. But then when I think of the, and this is my confusion, like how, especially like after 8 years, this class discussion is separated from the cultural terms, so-called like ethnicity and so forth discussion. I mean, are they really referring to different like relations? I mean, can we really think of that discussion significant or not? Because I was like before thinking it wasn't that significant the way I was thinking social groups and so forth, but are they really like referring different social relations maybe? I mean, is the like core of the debate is going there that, I don't know, at least I'm not that much aware of as well. But I mean, how we see the formation of these like
certain ethnic groups, tribes, Cemaats, and so forth, on which basis, if it is not really cultural substance itself, like one part of the substance we can point at, like versus a like class formation as another like social group and so forth. I mean, just my confusion really.
No, you're not confused. I think you put it very well. I think we're also always victims to academic fads. I mean, every new academic generation has to say things, has to say that the previous generation had these concepts and they were somewhat wrong. We have to turn it around. We have to deconstruct what they were doing. And they often overdo it. So Frederick Barnes, I think, was very important, his intervention in the debate about ethnic groups, when he said boundaries and boundary maintenance are much more important. He said the boundary is more important than the cultural stuff within it. Later he retracted a little bit. And even in the original article, he says something like he had to persuade some Pathan group that another Pathan group was really Pathan because they shared certain properties, which must have been cultural properties. So he had to show that they have certain cultural elements in order to qualify as Pathan. So, in spite of his own claim, culture was part of the substance, but not all of it. I mean, it was not culture alone that defined what an ethnic group is. But the boundary is maintained by using certain symbols, and the group, or leaders of the group, representatives of the group, choose certain symbols to mark this boundary. Now, for the Kurds, what would be the important symbols of Kurdish identity? Whatever they speak, I always think that the Kurdish language is very important. And Ahmadi Khani, who wrote in the late 17th century? No, 18th century, sorry. 70s, late 70s, yes. Is an important symbol because he wrote them in a Medeni Kürtçe, the Kurdish language was important. Perhaps tribal organization was also an important symbol at one time. Modern national movements have tried to find other symbols. In the journal Jin, published in Istanbul in 1918, 1919, Mendo Selim writes about we Kurds have to develop our national symbols. I mean, there's a very clear awareness. How do we show to everyone what is a Kurd and what is not a Kurd? So we have to celebrate our national feasts. He does not mention Nowruz yet, but I mean, Nowruz, of course, became a very important marker of Kurdish identity. So, even if it is boundary maintenance, you still appeal to cultural traditions. And you cannot invent cultural traditions from scratch. A certain amount of manipulation is possible. You can emphasize or de-emphasize, but you have to work with things that already exist. You cannot invent them from nothing. So culture remains much more important. So what has often been said, the interactionist intervention and against the culturalist attitude about a culturalist approach to ethnicity, the interactionist where ethnicity is primarily defined by the way its members interact with members of other ethnic groups, I mean, has perhaps overemphasized that culture may be changing and so on, but culture remains important, I think. People may decide to emphasize a certain aspect and de-emphasize other aspects. You started with the race. I mean, I have always found it striking. In Western Europe, we do not like speaking about race. Because we have had the Second World War in which race was a very significant factor. So we have always spoken about ethnicity, but in Anglo-Saxon countries, race has often been used in the same sense as we use ethnicity, even for white people. And in North America and Australia, I found that race is only when you speak about blacks, and ethnicity is when you speak about more or less white people. So Hispanics are ethnics. In Australia, they call, when he's an ethnic, that maybe he may be from Lebanon, or he may be from Germany, he's ethnic. Well, no, Germany is not even ethnic. Germany is just ordinary white. But ethnic is somewhat less white, and you may have race, and then you're an Aborigines, or you're an African. But I think that says much more about the societies that use these labels than about the utility of the label as a concept. Race is not, race maybe, we may study race, and some people have been studying the DNA of different populations in Turkey, showing that the sample was too small, I think, but that Turks have more in common with Armenians than with any other people. Whatever that means. I don't think it is socially significant. So I think it is more interesting to look at the type of things that make people actually make these distinctions, mark these boundaries, and they're rarely biological. Some people say the police in Istanbul late at night makes a choice about which people to ask for their identity cards and not. And I think they do this on the basis of physical features, which may partly be biological features, partly body language and all these sort of cultural things. So there is perhaps in ourselves always the idea that different people are perhaps also distinguishable biologically. But in most cases what we really see is markers of clothing, body language, the way the hair is cut and so on.
But still that culture itself, doesn't it just like mediates a relation itself, and like how you said that it's a mutual help process. That is the relation. I mean, like what you give, what you take out, and so forth. So, like I mean, I'm going through this kinship studies on the principle of exchange. So it is more based on like the cultural significance, like the symbols and so forth. In a way, identify to like whom to help, to whom to like punish within the rules of the tribe, Cemaats, kind of thing. So it is more like setting up the boundaries to make it like visible and continue. I mean, it has like certain meaning and so forth. So they are used like as the mediums, as the tools, maybe social tools. But like what looks like more composing the relations itself, and how this diversification all the time is changing, differentiation throughout history and so forth, more looks like on the dynamics of the exchange. So that's why I was thinking, and like this like class discussion, how it itself as well turned into like matter of exchange and the logic of distribution, and like the whole like tribe logic like works the kind of logic of distribution. It's not that it is necessarily egalitarian or like whatever, but it is like setting up those positions through a distribution of certain things. This can be like symbolic or material or whatever, that doesn't matter. But it shows us a certain like organization. So this is a certain dynamic, and like really a certain principle of exchange, and produces more like these kinds of social groups. So when we think of class, I mean now I'm reconsidering really, that's why I'm saying I'm confused. I mean on the basis of class we are not able to really necessarily think of the principle of exchange in the formation of class, but still when we think of class in terms of a distribution logic, I mean, who has what, like what income and so forth, the relation that holds all them together can be again think of in the exchange logic actually, I mean, like, between even the capitalist and the worker, or like among the competition between the like workers or whatever, or among the capitalists. Again, like looks like working on that kind of a principle of relation. So. I mean, I feel like in that sense, like we are thinking of class in terms of ethnic groups or like tribes and Cemaats that is based on a certain understanding of relations. And afterwards, it is culturalized, and certain cultural means are used to symbolize or like point at to show the boundaries and so forth. But what makes it really, if it is a relational thing, it is not the thing itself, the group itself. It's not one culture, one language, or one like whatever religion, even or I mean these are like looks like very accurate, very visible, objectified symbols, but the whole empirical reality denies them actually in one sort. I mean how they fluctuate. So it has to be. I mean the whole this dynamic should be like residing somewhere else, and that's what I see.
It
This
seems
like
that
relations.
you're asking me to give you an essentialist answer.
Yeah, okay. No, I'm saying obviously if it is not, when we say that there is no essentialist answer to these things, then if we are only looking at relations, then like how we really think
of relations and cultural resources and so on, ecology.
The problem, for instance, in relation to culture, the concept of cultural resources implies something, I guess, I'm afraid, something essentialist. That's the problem.
More. I mean, we passed through that discussion.
We know that on an overwhelmingly huge area, actually, in pre-Muslim times. In pagan times, people used to celebrate this something. Okay, the name Nevruz is of Iranian origin. I didn't remember. I'm just remembering a famous opera, Sacred Printemps, this spring rite. So even in distant parts of Russia, people were celebrating stuff. Now, that was there, but meaning nothing in terms of Kurdishness. The critical thing is, it appears to be that, for instance, the emphasis on Nevruz, it appears to be, follows the Turkish government's emphasis on Sunni Islamic religion in the area. That appears to be kind of coincidence, actually. One trying to promote Islamism and Islamic values, the other one, PKK, at least in those times, having Marxist connotations, etc. Trying to emphasize perhaps the point of distinction I'm making use of, holding this and translating this into a specific symbol. So the symbol was not there as symbol.
Well, it was raised into a symbol by the Iraqi Kurds first, long before the PKK. And the Nowruz is now connected with the myth of Kabe, the dragon slayer or the king slayer, the only person in the Shahnameh, the only commoner who is not a king, but who kills the king, who is a revolutionary. In the Shahnameh, he then makes someone else king, Faridun becomes king. But there is a Kurdish oral version of this, in which Kabe not only kills the old king, but he establishes a sort of people's republic instead of a kingdom. We do not know when this version emerged. It may be very recent, but it has existed for many decades already. And it was adopted by the Iraqi Kurds in the 1960s. And from Iraq, gradually those Kurds who were aware of the Kurdish movement in Iraq, in Turkey also started adopting the idea of Nowruz and the story of Kabe. And there was even a movement called Kabe. And it had a symbol, as a symbol, a real proletarian. So it was not a cultural resource that had always been only Kurdish, but it was there. It was part of the Iranian tradition, and even the Turkish-speaking peoples of Central Asia know Nowruz and celebrate Nowruz. But it was there as something that the Kurds had, and it became associated with the struggle of the Kurds. And it became associated with one particular interpretation of the Shahnameh and of the rebellion of Kabe. And there's several other stories that are related about the origins of the Kurds that you do find them in all the medieval Arab writers. So there were these resources, and people picked them selectively and developed them into a story that is convincing to many people. And it makes the Kurds feel, here we have an important thing that belongs to us and not to our neighbors. The Arabs don't have it. The Turks don't have it. The Persians, the Persians are not so different.
I remember Turkish government's attempt, for instance, to make the academicians write down articles claiming that Nowruz was original Central Asian and Turkish.
Yes. It seems that a certain fatigue is setting in the audience.
Yes, I want to ask a question about Shulamis, migrated to Lebanon from Mardin.
You look like you could be Mahanu yourself.
Yeah. Okay. So, you know, there are some Mahlamis in Beirut, in all Lebanon. For example, their surnames just like Kurdi or Maradini, and some of them say they are Kurds, and some of them say at the same time they are Syrians, Assyrians. So now I get confused. Who are they? The Mahlamis living in Lebanon. They are Kurds, they are Syrians, or they are Arabic-speaking Kurds or not? I really got confused right now after you as well.
Yeah, well, everyone gets confused because it feels that what people think they are, or what they claim they are, what they want to be, can change from time to time. And people make these convincing claims to themselves. I mean, the Mahalami were a tribe living among other tribes in Tor Abdin, and they were very similar to Kurmanji-speaking tribes. So in that environment, because they were nomadic, everyone said, well, they're Kurds because they're nomadic. Well, they speak Arabic, so what? Not a big deal. So when they go to Lebanon, they can either decide to be Arabs like the other Lebanese. Many of the Lebanese are also not very Arab. They also have this history of being something else. They needed to distinguish themselves. And in Lebanon, many of them initially started calling themselves Kurds. The other Arabs called them Kurds. These guys speak Arabic, but it's a different Arabic, and they have different ways of talking, and they're Kurds, they said. So they adopted this. There is a Mahalami association, a formal organization, which defined itself as Kurds. There are other Kurmanjis, they're in a separate organization, and it is very well possible that some of the Mahalamis, or all of the Mahalamis, in due time have become Arabs again. When I last saw Mahalamis in Tor Abdin, they all said, we have always been Arabs. We have never been Kurds. But I mean, in Berlin, I have a friend who is Mahalami, and he said, we have always been Kurds. We speak Arabic, but I mean, many of the Kurds in Syria, they all speak Arabic. Well, some speak Kurmanji, but all the publications of the Kurdish parties in Syria used to be in Arabic. That was the language that people spoke. Like Kurds in Turkey have for a long time spoken Turkish. PKK used Turkish, which was very useful, so that it didn't have to go to this debate about whether the Zazas are Kurds or not. I mean, if everyone speaks Turkish, everyone can be deciding to be a Kurd, whatever the language they speak in their families at home. So, your Mahalamis are like the Zazas. I mean, they can negotiate if it's in their interest, if it serves their purpose, or to protect their community. They may decide to ally with Kurds as Arabic-speaking Kurds, but in other contexts they may decide to be somewhat different Arabs. In Izmir I found a group of Mahalamis who also were, because that was a time when many people in Izmir did not really like the Kurds. So the Mahalamis went out of their way to show that they were Arabs and not Kurds. The context may be very important in the way people show their identities. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for listening so much.
Thank you very much.
Şunu